now seemed like a gloomy and oppressive place. The shadows looked darker, the corners more sinister. I felt eyes watching me all the time even when I was. It was on one of those nights when I was working overtime again, that it happened. I was in the office trying to concentrating on the numbers when I heard a noise coming from the warehouse. It wasn't like the other strange sounds I had heard before. It was a scream of pure terror and agony. I ran to see what it was, my heart almost jumping out of my mouth, and there, in the middle of the warehouse, was Raphael, but he was no longer the Raphael I knew. He was a skeletal figure. The hollow and crazed eyes looked at me and he shouted, "Beatrice is here, she came for me." And then, before I could do anything, he collapsed on the floor. What happened after that night? The warehouse is a blur in my memory. I remember screaming for help, calling an ambulance, desperately trying to revive Raphael, but it was too late. He left, taking with him the mystery of what had really happened. The doctors spoke of a heart attack, of a body weakened by extreme stress, but I knew the truth was much darker, much more terrifying than any medical explanation could provide. The funeral was a surreal experience. I felt like an intruder, as if I didn't. I had the right to be there. Raphael's wife shot me glances that were a mix of pain and accusation. The little son, confused and scared, kept asking when his dad was coming back, and I was there, paralyzed by his gaze, filled with guilt and fear of what had happened, fear of what could still happen, because something told me that this was not the end, it was just the beginning. In the days that followed, I tried to return to the normal routine. I went to work, took care of things in the warehouse, tried to act as if nothing would have happened, but it was impossible. Every corner of that place reminded me of Raphael, the terror in his eyes that last night. The shadows seemed denser, the noises more threatening. I could no longer stay there alone after dark. Fear had become my constant companion. It was during that time that I started noticing strange things happening to me. Horrible nightmares that woke me up screaming in the middle of the night, shapes I saw out of the corner of my eye, but that disappeared when I looked directly at them, and that constant feeling of being watched, of there always being something lurking there, waiting for the right moment to strike. I was becoming paranoid. Or was I going through the same thing that had happened to Raphael? Desperate for answers, I went to look for Dona Consuelo. The old healer received me with a grave look, as if she already knew what had happened. Without me saying anything, she began to speak. He said that Raphael's death had opened a portal, that the entity that tormented him was now free and stronger than ever, and that this entity, I had a target in mind. I left there more scared than ever, but also with a certainty. I had to do something to end that once and for all. I started to investigate, to look for information about witchcraft, about evil entities, about how to protect oneself from those kinds of things. I spent sleepless nights reading old books, visiting dark corners of the internet, talking to people who claimed to understand these matters. I learned about protection rituals, about amulets, about how to purify environments. I made a hole. Desperate to find something that worked, but nothing seemed to help. Things only got worse. The nightmares became more intense, the visions more frequent. I could barely sleep. I could barely eat. I was consuming it when I had found a crack to our world. It was on a particularly bad night, when I was almost ready to give up, that I had a revelation. I remembered a distant aunt, a woman who was always considered the black sheep of the family. They said she got involved with things it was better to stay away from, and suddenly everything made sense. The old fights, the hateful looks she gave me when I was a child, the veiled threats. Could it be her? Could it be that this entire nightmare had started because of an old resentment, a desire for revenge that had spiraled out of control? I didn't know, but I was determined to find out, even if it meant facing my worst fears. With this new suspicion in mind, I decided it was time to confront my Aunt Carmela. It wasn't easy to find her. She lived isolated in a little house on the outskirts of San Luis Potosí, far from everything and everyone. When I finally got there, my heart was beating so hard that I thought it was going to explode. The house was gloomy, surrounded by twisted trees that seemed to want to grab anyone who approached. The air there was heavy, laden with an energy that sent shivers down my spine. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I was about to leave when I heard a noise coming from inside. I pushed the door, which opened with a sinister creak. The interior of the house was even worse than the exterior. It was dark, full of dust, full of strange objects that did not. I could identify her, and there she was sitting in a rocking chair in the corner of the room, my Aunt Carmela, but she was not the woman I remembered. Her eyes were sunken, her face gaunt, as if something were slowly draining her life away. When he saw me, a crooked smile formed on his lips. "You finally came, niece," he said with a hoarse voice. "You took your time, but you finally understood." I wanted to scream, I wanted to demand explanations, but the words got stuck in my throat. Carmela kept talking, her voice growing louder and louder. She spoke of resentments. Old stories about how the family had sidelined her, about how I had everything she had always wanted. And then, with a wicked gleam in her eyes, she confessed that she had indeed cast a spell against me, but things had gotten out of control. What Carmela didn't expect was that the entity she summoned would be so powerful, so thirsty for chaos and destruction. The spell was meant to torment me, not to kill anyone, but it was already too late. The thing she had brought into our world was loose and even she couldn't control it. I saw the fear in the eyes of my aunt, a fear that mirrored my own. At that moment, I understood that we were both of something much bigger and more terrible than any family feud. We spent hours talking, Carmela telling me everything she knew about the entity, about how to try to contain it. But the more she talked, the more I realized we were dealing with something beyond our understanding. The night fell, and with it came a sense of oppression that churned my stomach. The shadows in the house seemed to come to life, moving in ways impossible, and then in the midst of that darkness, we heard it, a faint whisper at first but growing louder, a voice that was not of this world. What happened next is difficult to describe. The entire house began to tremble, objects flew through the air as if they had a life of their own. I saw my aunt being thrown against the wall by an invisible force, her body falling to the ground like a rag doll. I wanted to run, I wanted to flee from there, but my feet seemed glued to the floor, and then, in the midst of all that chaos, I saw it. The entity was nothing like I had imagined. It was a mass of shadows and smoke with eyes that glowed like embers in the darkness, and those eyes were fixed on me. I don't know where I found the strength, but I began to recite the words of protection I had learned in my research. My voice trembled, but I didn't stop. The entity let out a scream that shattered the windows, hurling them towards me. I closed my eyes, sure it was my end, but then I felt a hand grasp mine. It was Carmela. With her last breath of life, our voices united in the enchantment. They came together, growing in strength and power. What followed was a battle of wills. The two of us, aunt and niece, united against a force of evil that threatened not only us but everyone we loved. I don't know how long it lasted, it could have been minutes or hours, but finally, with one last scream of fury, the entity began to dissipate. The shadows receded, the darkness began to fade, and when I opened my eyes, I saw the first rays of the sun coming through the broken windows. That finished, but at what cost? The rising sun illuminated the rubble of what used to be my Aunt Carmela's house. I looked around, still dazed by what had happened. His body lay motionless on the ground. I approached carefully, fearing the worst, but to my surprise, he was still breathing, albeit with difficulty. His eyes slowly opened, meeting mine. There was no longer any hatred or resentment in them, only deep sadness and regret. "Forgive me, Beatrice," he whispered with a weak voice. "I didn't know, I couldn't have imagined it would come to this." What? I grabbed her hand, feeling a confusing mix of emotions, anger at what she had done, relief at having survived, and a strange compassion for this woman who, in the end, was as much a victim as I was. "It's okay, Aunt," I replied, surprised by the sincerity in my own voice. "It's over, we won." I called an ambulance and Carmela was rushed to the hospital. I stayed by her side during her recovery, listening to her stories, understanding better what led her to do what she did. It wasn't easy to forgive, but little by little, I gradually realized that forgiveness was more for me than for her. It was the only way to move on, to free myself from the weight of that horrible experience. I went back to work a few weeks later, determined to resume my normal life, but nothing was the same as before. The warehouse, which had once been the scene of so much terror, now seemed strangely calm. The shadows were just shadows, the noises just the normal sounds of an old building. Even so, I couldn't help but get goosebumps every time I was left alone there afterward. As my thoughts darkened, they frequently turned to Raphael and his family. The guilt still weighed on my heart, even though I knew it hadn't really been my fault. I decided that I had to do something for them. I started to help Raphael's son financially, making sure he received a good education. Over time, the relationship with Raphael's widow improved. She never knew the whole truth about what happened, but I think in some way she felt that I was genuinely remorseful and caring. The years went by and life went on. Mariana and I continued running the company, which grew even more. I got married, had children, built a life that, from the outside, seemed perfectly normal, but I always carried with me the memory of those days of terror like a heavy secret that I could never fully share with anyone. My name is Carmen and I have a spine-chilling story to tell. It all started when I was 28 years old and living in San Luis Potosí, Mexico. What a beautiful city, full of history and tradition. I worked in my cousin Elena's craft store, right in the heart of the historic center. Oh, what a charming place, full of unique pieces that told the stories of